Hello everyone, welcome to another video. Today I would like to start the discussion of improvising in the classical style in music therapy. The classical music was so important for the music therapy history, especially in terms of how the classical music helped to develop the receptive methods in music therapy. For sure we have something about classical music in terms of how to improvise or how to create accompaniments in music therapy, but these materials, they are limited. So for example, we have in the book Functional Piano for Music Therapists and Music Educators, an exploration of styles from Just Massicot. We have some nice examples about classical music. As well, if we have the book Improvising Styles, a workbook for music therapists, educators and musicians, we have this book from Colin Lee and Mark Houde. As well, we have nice examples. For sure, if you didn't have access to all these books, and if you want to learn more about how to improvise in the classical music, here you have the opportunity in this YouTube channel. So I'm recording many videos about this topic. So this is only the theoretical video, but you have many practical videos where I will show to you many examples. For sure, when we improvise classical music with our clients, first of all, we need to define what classical music is. So when we have a really broad definition, we can say that a classical music is art music produced or rooted in the traditions of the Western culture, including both liturgical, in this case religious, and secular music. So it's impossible to define completely the periods, but normally people, they established that the classical music eras, we have some standards about this, that we start in the medieval, going to Renaissance, afterwards we have the Baroque era, classical era, romantic, and afterwards we have many different movements. So in the end of the 19th century, so for instance, we have the Impressionism, we have the Modernism, so in a way that we have different things in terms of music. For sure, these are the really main periods of the classical music. And when we talk about music therapy and how to play in a classical way, we are talking about taking some characteristics of one or more periods of the classical music and try to put in our hands or in our mouths to play in different ways. So for sure, some characteristics from, for instance, from the Renaissance continue in the Baroque, some things from the Baroque continued in the classical and the Romantic period, so some things from the Romantic, they continued in the Impressionism. So in a way, so even that we have specific things from one period, these things can be repeated in other periods, or in a way that people, they still use these things from different periods of the music history. Okay, so when we organize our improvisations in music therapy and when we want to sound classical, I need to consider the musical parameters, because considering the musical parameters in each of these different periods of the music history, we have different things how people, they manage these different musical parameters. So for instance, timbre. So we have many different ways to consider timbre when we are playing in the classical music, because the timbre that people, they use, for instance, in Baroque with the harpsichord, it was different when we consider, when we go to the classical, when we start using piano. And the same thing regarding the Romantic, when we have the symphonies with many instruments, or when we are going more in the Impressionism, taking things from the Debussy and Ravel, the way of playing is always different when we consider timbre. In terms of rhythm, for sure in the rhythm we have a lot of differences, because the way that people, they can play the rhythm of a melody, or the way that they play the basic beat or the basic pulse for a piece can be different as well. And this is important to consider, so the rhythm can be important to consider. Wow, in terms of melody, yes, in the melody we have something amazing considering the differences among the different eras. So the way that people did a lot of complexity things in the complex things in the Baroque. So we have something really simple, or more in a way you have something clear during the classical period. And again, in the Romanticism you have a lot of things, a lot of textures, a lot of sounds, you have many different things. So the melody is something that will change a lot. And for sure in the Impressionism we change a lot, because you are not really concerned about playing in taking this consideration about the keys, tonality, because in Impressionism you start having something different. If we go more and try to look about phrasing, wow, phrasing, this is amazing, because phrasing, I can consider that we have many different ways in terms of using legato, staccato, using rubato, for instance. We have a lot of difference in terms of phrasing when we consider the different periods of the music history for the classical music, for sure. And as I said before, so I started talking about texture. So texture is something really important. So in a way that we have in the Baroque a lot of polyphony compositions, in the classical you have more just accompaniment and one melody. So you have many differences when we consider this. More going to the modernist music, you have more different connections between the voices, something different that we didn't have in the previous periods of the music history. So just to give you this broad perception that musical parameters is something important that you need to consider when you are doing your improvisation in the classical style. For sure, in one improvisation, I can play characteristics, or I can add elements that we consider more than one period of the music history. So I can play in an improvisation something from the classical period, doing something in the Impressionism period. So I can play in many different ways, just adding things for my improvisation. And another important thing when you are improvising classical music in music therapy is that your client can recognize that you are sounding classical. For sure, this is not your main intention. Your main intention when you're using classical music to improvise is just establishing something in a way that you have a ground, that you have a foundation, because when you are playing one specific frame or some characteristics of classical music, you have more resources to explore during the improvisation. For sure, you can use the classical music just to provide resources for you and for the client to improvise, just in a broad way, but you can play as well classical music to provide resources in a way that your client can play in the same style that you are playing. And this is pretty cool, because when you are playing in the same style with your client, you are doing what Tony Wigram calls extemporizing. So you are playing, you and your client or the group of clients, based on the same agreement, so in the same style. And this is a really amazing possibility. So to achieve this possibility that even your client or your clients will recognize that you're playing the classical music, it's important that you can use some standards for the Western world in some ways, or the mass media, because even that many people, they know a lot about classical music, some people, they only know the standards or the really famous compositions. So in a way, this is a nice advice. You can use classical or really important and famous compositions to use in music therapy. So this is a suggestion for you. If you want to sound classical, one possibility is to take a part of a composition and you can start playing the original composition and just start from this point, and afterwards you start elaborating more the theme and you start to improvise based in this theme. For example, you can start, for instance, improvising. You can do an improvisation taking for instance one really typical theme from ba 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 da 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 bam bam bam, or I can take da 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 da. So I can take something from Mozart, for instance, or I can take something from Beethoven. Dum bum ba dum bum bum ba dum bum 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 ba dum. Because when people they hear these really famous themes, they will hear that you are in the classical environment and you can use these examples. Yes, this is pretty cool. This is the first way that you can improvise. So just take the really famous compositions and take the idea and start to improvise. The second way that you can improvise, so you can take basic foundations for some periods and you can use these foundations to improvise. For instance, there are many famous chord progressions that people they use in the classical music that you can take these chord progressions and you can incorporate in your improvisation. Or other thing that many people they do to sound really classical, because especially during the Baroque, the classical and the Romantic period, people they use it a lot that we call more in the Baroque and the classical period that they call ornaments. So ornaments, they are ways to decorate your melody, and we have many ornaments. We have the trill, we have the turn, so we have many different ways that you can add elements in the melody, and this was really typical from the classical music, especially in the Baroque and in the classical period. So in some ways, what I'm saying that you can take basic characteristics from the classical music that they exaggerated in a way that they use it, these different characteristics. I'm not saying that people they are not using things from the classical music and the pop music and other genres, but in many ways in the classical music there are some things that people they exaggerated only in the previous periods of the music history, and this is something that you can use in your improvisations. Okay, so I said using something from many different classical or famous compositions to incorporate in your improvisation, or just use really standard characteristics that the composers they exaggerated during the different periods of the classical music. So these two things, they will be so important for you to improvise. And just to finish, one suggestion, especially if you want to hear especially things from the Baroque going to classical and ending in the Romantic period, I really advise you to hear progressive rock, but especially neoclassical heavy metal, because the composers from the neoclassical heavy metal, they really heard a lot this exaggeration in terms of the different music characteristics, and they incorporated in their songs. So this is a suggestion, and even I have a link here, so if you want to hear some examples of neoclassical heavy metal, I have one publication for The Guardian. So in The Guardian they selected the top 10 of the neoclassical heavy metal, so heavy metal songs that they were inspired, or when the musicians they are playing classical music in heavy metal. And I think it's a nice way if you want to hear how you can combine classical music with other genres. Thanks a lot for watching, and please, it's so important that you can now start watching the other practical videos about how to play classical music in music therapy. Thank you so much, and see you in the next video. Bye bye.